Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest in this week's episode is Currey Cook. He's an attorney and advocate for Lambda Legal, and he specializes in working with children and families in the foster care and child welfare agencies across the country. The issue is whether states can discriminate against LGBTQ families, specifically by protecting private faith-based organizations that receive federal dollars and work with state agencies in adoption and foster care programs in states like Oklahoma and Kansas and Mississippi and Alabama and Michigan. The answer is they think they can. Will those state laws stand up to federal constitutional challenges? You won't want to miss this really important conversation that involves the welfare of children across the country. Stay tuned. My guest today on Good Law, Bad Law is Currey Cook. Currey is Counsel and Director of the Youth and Out-of-Home Care Network for Lambda Legal in New York City. So first of all, Currey, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
So the genesis of this episode and of my reaching out to Lambda Legal and having the great fortune to have you agree to do the program with me was an article I saw a couple of days ago about some legislative initiatives in Oklahoma and Kansas and how the national news media is really ignoring what's going on, not only in these two states, but in other states around the country with regard to anti-LGBT laws when it comes to foster care and adoption. Such a huge issue that is really not getting the attention that it deserves. So I want to talk with you about that. And as we lead into that, Currey, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you do at Lambda Legal, and that way we can really set the table for this conversation.
Sure. So as you said, I direct the Youth and Out-of-Home Care Project here at Lambda Legal. So most of my advocacy is on behalf of LGBTQ youth and youth living with HIV that are involved in our nation's foster care systems, and also youth in juvenile justice settings, and on behalf of youth experiencing homelessness. And that involves both impact litigation, proactive policy development with jurisdictions that are trying to do better by LGBTQ youth and families in their systems, and then also a lot of training and education for professionals that work within that system. In addition to advocacy for LGBTQ youth, we do advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ people and families that are involved in child welfare systems and trying to be foster and adoptive parents. My background before joining Lambda Legal about 5 years ago was an attorney for children in foster care systems and defending juveniles involved in delinquency system. And I practiced in Alaska for about 12 years, and then and then for 5 years after is here in New York, and taught at the Rutgers Child Advocacy Clinic at Rutgers Law in Newark, and did some work for the National Juvenile Defender Center, and now serve on the board of the National Association of Counsel for Children. So advocacy for young people in foster care and in delinquency systems has sort of been my life's work and passion. So I was thrilled to be able to come to Lambda Legal and do some advocacy to try to change these systems for the better for LGBTQ youth and families. In my practice and just direct advocacy as a direct service provider, and I really saw how systems are really ill-equipped to meet the needs of LGBTQ youth, and also how LGBTQ families and same-sex couples really experienced very disparate treatment within systems, and often really bore the brunt of just ignorance and just these myths and stereotypes about LGBT people parenting that just persist even today. So Lambda has had a long history of advocacy in the foster care system. I think the first project started over 12 years ago, looking at the needs of youth in foster care, because we were hearing just pretty awful stories about how these systems that were supposed to be helping young people were actually harming them. And then that kind of morphed into the Youth and Out of Home Care Project. We've had long partnerships with the Child Welfare League of America and other organizations that really set the professional standards for youth and families in care, and helped really develop a lot of information and education for folks within the system about how to do better by youth and families. And
So
part of
you've really,
that, yeah. I'm sorry,
so
go ahead.
you've really worked coast to coast. If you, I mean, I don't even know if that's accurate, but 12 years in Alaska and now into New York City and looking at the problem nationally. Are you from Alaska originally? Is that how you came to spend time there?
No, I won't go into the long, boring story of how I got there, but I actually grew up in Georgia. I grew
Oh,
up on a farm outside of Athens, and
oh my
went to
gosh.
went to college and law school in
Are
Georgia,
you a
and then
bulldog?
I am a bulldog.
Oh my God,
My
my wife
father.
is a bulldog. My wife is from Savannah originally, and she went to the University of Georgia.
It's a good time to be a bulldog these
I'll tell you,
days.
and we actually
There,
went to the Rose Bowl this year and saw one of the great games of all time.
Yes, yes. I had more texts from my dad than I've ever had in the last 5 years through
Amazing.
all the playoff season. Yeah, my dad worked for the University of Georgia, so
Oh,
I
okay.
kind of I kind of was born into being a bulldog. But
Right. Well, as my wife says to her kids, my stepkids, you've got Georgia blood coursing through your veins. So.
yes, yes. So I moved to Alaska
Mhm.
after law school, and I worked for a state agency called the Office of Public Advocacy,
Mhm.
in the child advocacy section there. So
So,
yes, I mean it has been. I think it's been a helpful experience, understanding and seeing how different child welfare systems and different family courts, navigate issues for LGBT youth and families.
so when you say systems, and you've used that a couple of times, I just want to make sure folks understand what we're talking about. When you say child welfare systems, what are you really talking about?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think it gets to one of your earlier points of sort of why isn't there more coverage about what's happening in foster care systems, um, because each state has its own child welfare agency. In most places, that is a standalone division, usually under the state's Department of Social Services or Department of Health and Human Services, whatever they
Hmm.
call it. It's usually a subdivision of those, but is
Hmm.
a government agency. And each state has a slightly different service delivery model. Some are very county based, so each county will have a division of youth services or family services, and they'll administer services there, or some places like Alaska have a very state-based system where all the caseworkers are state employees and work for the state. And then all of states have various models of service delivery. Some are what some people call very privatized, right? So Florida is a great
Hmm.
example, right? When a report of harm is called in that a child has been abused or neglected, a state worker will investigate that report and come to a determination. And then if they think a child has been harmed and needs to be removed from home, they will take it to court. If there's a finding that there's probable cause for a child to be placed in custody, then all the services for that child after that in Florida are privatized. They're turned over to government contract agencies that then provide the service delivery and contract with subcontractors to provide counseling or services or whatever the child or family needs.
Hmm.
So some states don't have that privatized model. So Alaska is a good example that they do have contract providers that, for example, will run a group home and provide a placement for a child. But the state workers themselves actually like work the case, work with the family, do all that. So there's all kinds of variations in between. But I think the important takeaway from that is um, child welfare services, regardless of how you decide to operate your system, are government functions, right? I mean, it's either direct service delivery or it's a contract paid for by the government, right? That
And
is how the services are provided.
And we're going to talk about what's happening in a number of states around the country, but so far, as you've described it, with all the variations in the way child welfare services are handled in different states, um, this is an area of law, obviously, that is a function of state law. In other words, it sounds like there isn't some um, overarching federal system or series of federal laws or regulations that would apply here. Is that right?
No, there are federal laws that apply.
Hmm.
So the main ones are Title 4E and 4B of the Social Security Act. So those are the sort of founding federal laws that basically provide the vast majority of the funding, the sort of flow through funding for state systems. So most
Okay.
states operate and children are served via a mix of state and federal dollars. So it depends on the state what the mix is, but most range between, say 45% to 60%, 55%, 60% of federal funds funding their
Hmm.
system. And one of the debates, I guess, or questions that has come up is federal law does in the child welfare system doesn't explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sex or on sexual orientation or gender identity. But it does, however, require that all of the states actually are required to ensure the safety, permanency, so finding a permanent home, and well-being of children in their care. And at the end of the Obama administration, the HHS grants rule was
Hmm.
promulgated, which actually does say that any state, any beneficiary of HHS grants actually has to ensure that the beneficiaries of those grants are not discriminated against based on, usual protected classes and including sexual orientation or gender identity. So there are federal protections for youth in that sense as beneficiaries of these federal funds, right? But that has been, something that some proponents of these laws have used as well, of course, we're not going to discriminate based on race because that is protected, but there's nothing that says we can't discriminate based on sex or sexual orientation or gender identity, which, of course, is forgetting that we have the Constitution at play.
Well, right, and
Always.
that's where the conflict between what's happening in the varying states and what federal anti-discrimination, federal civil rights protections you would think guarantee to all citizens, and that seems to be the big issue, and what is being how these issues are being handled in the Trump era as compared to the way things were handled in prior administrations. That is, whether sexual orientation, sexual identity is included in the definitions of what is protected by our federal civil rights laws. So
That's right.
maybe we need to start with now, kind of with the teasing out of the way. What's actually going on, and maybe we can start with the latest, what I believe is the latest news, and that's what's happening in two states in particular, in Oklahoma and Kansas.
Right.
Set the scene for us, Currey. What are these two states now doing, and
Sure.
what's the latest news on out of those two states?
Um, I do want to add just one more thing about federal law in this area as it relates to these state child welfare religious refusal bills. So, federal child welfare law does say and require that a state's plan for service delivery to the children that they serve actually does ensure that the service delivery is provided in accordance with civil rights law and with professional standards in this area.
Mm-hmm.
And and those standards are set by folks like the Child Welfare League of America and other social science and child welfare organizations that put out standards for how children and families should be served. And unsurprisingly, they all uniformly say that you should not discriminate against children and families on any basis, and that you should make sure that your system is welcoming to LGBT parents and parents of different faiths. So I'll circle back to that in terms of
Yeah, we
how
need to.
these laws apply.
Yeah, because there are cases that are coming before the courts now that are addressing this issue of what is the scope of federal civil rights protections. But yeah, let's circle back to that and um, because that's going to become really important in understanding whether these discriminatory laws that are working their way through various states are going to withstand constitutional challenge at some points. But tell us what's happening in Oklahoma and Kansas in particular right now.
Sure. So last Friday, Oklahoma's governor, Mary Fallin, became the first governor this year to sign into law an anti-LGBT state law. So it's been great to see that many of these anti-LGBT measures introduced across the country have died this year. Mm-hmm. But the measure that Governor Fallin signed, SB 1140, make Oklahoma the 8th state to enact one of these child welfare religious refusal laws that harm children in state care. So what they do is actually protect the providers who are government contractors with the state, who are faith-based and want to use their faith as a reason to discriminate against people that don't comport with their particular religious or moral mm-hmm. is in these bills, or moral convictions, right? Mm. So what that means is they can continue to receive government funds to deliver services and decide who they don't want to serve. So that could be a single person believing that only married couples could be good parents, or refuse to license a divorced couple because divorce is contrary to their set of religious beliefs. To, for example, if you are a Baptist provider, you could turn away a Jewish couple because they don't fit your idea of faith. And then, of course, one of the motivating factors for these is some providers desire to turn away same-sex couples because they believe that same-sex couples aren't good parents, or a trans person, or anybody along the LGBTQ spectrum.
So these are we say faith-based. These are religiously oriented private organizations that are essentially hired by the state or whatever is the government child welfare organization in the state. Here we're talking about Oklahoma. And because they have a religious orientation to their organization, and despite the fact that they receive federal dollars for these services, they can decide who they think is an appropriate parent, or what is the definition of an appropriate parent, and deny somebody or deny a couple the opportunity to take in a foster child, to take in an adopted child, both.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the way the laws are worded is to protect the contract or license that these agencies have to operate. So all of the bills and laws that are in effect, or the bills that are pending, have language that say something to the effect of a state or government entity cannot deny, revoke, interfere with the license, or deny a contract of a child placing agency is kind of the term that a lot of states use to describe these providers. Cannot deny or revoke that contract if the agency invokes its moral or religious beliefs to turn someone away. Interestingly enough, each state does set out its criteria as far as the state government is concerned of who can be a foster and adoptive parent, which of course, understandably, is quite extensive, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you have to pass a criminal background check. You have to not had any prior reports of issues around mistreatment of children.
Hmm.
All kinds of things. But those criteria now across the country are objective, right? I mean, as far as the state government is concerned, no one has anything on the books that says sexual orientation or gender identity are legitimate criteria to be used, right? But
Right.
these
Those criteria are neutral to the color of your skin. They're neutral to your religious faith. They're neutral to
exactly
your sexual orientation.
right. But you have these contractors who now, who are adding in their ideas based on their faith of what the criteria should be. A reality of some of these situations is that, unfortunately, this practice, it's been this sort of um, not so secret, dirty little secret of the child welfare system that you have had these faith-based contractors, inserting their notion of who's a good parent or who isn't based on their faith for a long time. And proponents have sort of used that to sort of say, well, we're just asking that the law reflect the status quo. But, part of that bad history on behalf of some of these agencies was actually using the fact that same-sex couples could not marry as a reason for a supposedly objective, criteria for why they wouldn't license. So, for example, before marriage equality was the law of the land, some of these faith-based agencies would just say, "Oh, we have just a criteria that you have to be married, and
Mm.
we're so sorry you can't get married. So we're
Right.
just it's out of our hands, right?" Which there is some, I think, probably now, somewhat dated research about the fact that married couples are, at least in theory, more stable. And I mean, I think there may be something to the fact that, obviously, if people are in a committed relationship, whether that's via marriage or just being in a committed relationship for a long time, that they may be more stable. But I think some of that notion is really outdated now, and so even that, I think, is a really sort of suspect reason for
Well,
turning
yeah, well, I
people
mean,
away.
we must have, I don't know how many, but I mean, I would imagine there are hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of families in this country that are defined as single parent households. So the idea that those families somehow could be discriminated against on some basis because they're single parent, I think most people would react pretty violently to that idea. Um,
Absolutely, just sort
you
of
know,
patently offensive, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
you're right. So,
So, okay.
that is sort of the history and around some of these things, and unfortunately, I mean, a lot of these agencies have used some sort of religious litmus test to provide services, and some, who do have these government contracts have pretty blatant statements on their website that we only work with families that subscribe to this particular set of religious beliefs.
What
So
is the scope, Curry? What is the scope of this issue? I mean, how do you have any sense whether on a state by state basis, we're talking about Oklahoma right now, but either on
right.
a state by state basis or nationally, what is the scope of this? How many children are we talking about who are looking for a home? How many parents are we or individuals are we talking about who are looking to take in a child, either a child by adoption or a child through the foster care system?
Yeah, it really varies pretty widely from state to state in terms of just the raw numbers of
Mhm.
kids that are actually in the system in each state and kids that are awaiting placement. But the vast majority of states have way more kids that need homes than they have placements for them.
Mm.
So, for example, and I'll just circle back to say Governor Fallon signed Oklahoma's version of this law on last Friday. Kansas's legislature passed the bill out a couple of weeks ago, and it actually is awaiting Governor Collier's signature. Right after it passed, he indicated his intent to sign. He hasn't signed yet, and I remain hopeful that maybe reason prevailed and he's not, but that's probably wishful thinking on my part.
I read that Governor Collier's administration during hearings on the bill testified in support of the bill. So, I mean, that's curious.
Exactly.
That's curious that he hasn't yet signed it, but the indication so far that he has an intent to sign that bill.
Which also, point out, is just really shocking and appalling that you have Gina Meyer Hummel, who is the head of Kansas's Department of Children and Families, publicly stating that she was in favor of a law that discriminates against people. I mean, that I think is just, given what I mentioned earlier about, the professional standards in this area, having a state child welfare director endorse one of these things is really just beyond the pale. So thankfully, the measures, a similar measure was defeated in Georgia and also died in Colorado, and was also a part of a broader, awful discriminatory bill in Missouri that stalled out. So it's not all bad news out of this session, but it's concerning that Oklahoma and possibly Kansas are going to be added to the list. So back to your question, I'll turn actually to South Carolina as a good example. So I guess a couple of years ago now, Children's Rights and South Carolina Appleseed and some other local organizations, child welfare organizations, actually sued the state of South Carolina in part because of a lack of placements for kids in care. That there were constitutional implications because the system was failing children because they were being placed in group homes or congregate care when they should be in family homes and were being harmed in those places. And now South Carolina actually just last week put in a proviso in the appropriations bill which actually directs the Department of Social Services to promulgate a regulation that enshrines this ability for contract providers to discriminate. So here we are in a state that settled a lawsuit that was in part about a lack of family homes, and they are busy working on putting something in place that would have the potential to reduce the number of available homes in a state.
Right.
And in South Carolina, a recent example of how this plays out, not just for LGBT people, happened, which is a provider, a Christian provider, Miracle Hill, turned away a different-sex Jewish couple who had applied to be foster parents. And the sort of sequence of events following that led South Carolina's Governor McMaster to issue an executive order that basically directed agencies to sort of make sure that these providers weren't being denied a contract if they did what Miracle Hill did.
So the governor issued an executive order protecting the right of this organization, of this contractor, to discriminate against this Jewish family in the example you gave.
Yes. I mean, his order directed state agencies to look at their policies and ensure their policies would protect an organization like Miracle Hill's actions. So it didn't itself put that into place, but did direct the state agencies to make sure that that Miracle Hill wouldn't be dinged for their license or their contract. So again, just a really just shocking sort of government endorsement of a particular set of beliefs.
Well, and I've got so many questions about this, but you before I do, you mentioned that the Oklahoma governor, who just the other day signed this. If depending on which side of the issue you're coming from, a religious refusal law or an anti-LGBTQ discrimination law, becoming the eighth state to pass such a law. I know some of the other states just want to make sure we identify Alabama, sure. South Dakota, Texas, Mississippi are 4 states that previously passed very similar legislation. From what I've read, what are the other states in this group of states that are passing these laws?
Virginia and Michigan are the other 2 states that have these laws in place. I do want to kind of point out just a few distinctions. I mean, one, Mississippi's, of course, was part of the larger HB 1523 in Mississippi, which was just this, a sweeping law that actually, on its text endorses a specific set of religious beliefs and, applies to all kinds of services in Mississippi. So that's by far the most, sweeping law of this type, and includes application to social services and child welfare. Alabama's law actually has an amendment that prohibits agencies receiving state or federal dollars from taking advantage of the law. So it is more limited in its scope and doesn't really apply to the foster care system because, as I mentioned before, all these agencies do receive a mix of state or federal dollars via the contracts to operate. Texas's is, in many aspects, the worst of the bunch because it has a particular component that specifically allows these providers to engage in religious education or instruction in the kids that they're serving. So that, I think, is just a major, talk about your sort of radar going off, lighting up, of just opening the door for, so-called conversion therapy type, behavior on the part of providers towards LGBTQ youth. I think particularly if you are, say, a young person in a faith-based group home, where you just, under the thumb of, in every part of your daily life, of a provider that's faith-based. Now, for example, you could be required to read scriptures as part of your, quote, treatment, program, and there's no repercussions for the provider. Yeah. And if you as a young person, say, hey, don't my rights say I have the right to be, free from this sort of imposition of religion on me? And when the child welfare agency's response would be, well, sure, but, what happens is we're now just going to have to move you somewhere else, right? Which I think, really illustrates one of the fundamental, flaws and most concerning aspects of these laws, which are that they actually flipped the paradigm in the child welfare system from the appropriate focus on the best interest of the child to the provider's so-called rights first.
Currey, we have to turn to the law. I mean, I'm a lawyer. You're a lawyer. This is this podcast. We talk about the law and why the law matters. Boy, if there isn't an issue that really begs the question here, I know there are many people probably who would say, "You're darn right. We're not going to let some Jewish family, adopt, or of course, we're not going to let a gay." But there have to be a lot of people too. I hope there are a lot of people too who would hear this and are just outraged that in 2018, any state could pass a law that would so blatantly allow for this kind of discrimination, particularly where children and their welfare is concerned. But we have this tension in our history as a country and in our constitutional history as it's played out in the courts between what a private individual can do, including discriminate if that individual chooses to, and the obligation to protect against discrimination, because we're citizens of this country and we all ought to benefit by the rights and protections guaranteed in the Constitution. So we see this play out and we've seen this play out in all kinds of situations. The Hobby Lobby case, when we talk about public funding under the Affordable Care Act, contraceptive care, the right of certain hospitals to refuse to perform abortions on religious or faith-based reasons, the right of a private hotel or lunch counter, if we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, to discriminate if they choose to on the basis of race. But here we are, we're in 2018. And, speak to that, if you would, on this tension and why it is that, in spite of these laws being passed at the state level, there should be a check on that on the basis of the constitutional rights and protections that should be available to all citizens. Why can't a faith-based organization in Oklahoma that doesn't believe, for their religious or faith-based reasons, in a same-sex couple being allowed to parent or take in a foster child or adopt, why can't they have that belief and act on that belief in terms of how they administer services?
Great question, and I think you're kind of, really getting to the core here of some of the really myths and just sort of blatant, falsehoods that proponents of these measures in the child welfare system are putting forth, which is the ridiculous notion that child welfare agencies are trying to push out people of faith from being foster and adoptive parents. There is a very rich history of faith-based agencies providing service to children in need. Mm-hmm. And that has been both horrible in some aspects and great in others. There are a lot of amazing faith-based providers who have provided services via government contracts and done so in a non-discriminatory way and welcomed all children and all families. So that exists, is positive, and continues, and they have understood their role as government contractors and actors to follow the law and follow the Constitution and serve people equally and with dignity. On the other hand, right, we have seen an awful history in this country of faith in the provision of helping children, right, of a wholesale removal of Native American children from their families because they were, quote, sinners and needed to be saved and placed in orphanages, which has still an awful, lasting legacy of trauma to Native American families, of their, wholesale removal from their culture. Here in New York City, where I live, there's an amazing book, The Lost Children of Wilder, chronicling New York City's awful history of faith-based providers who were discriminating on the basis of race in the name of religion. And so, we've long had an understanding that when you are stepping, and voluntarily, mind you, stepping in to accept a government contract to provide these services, that you then have to serve everybody, right? Mm-hmm. And cannot impose your own religious beliefs on the children that you're serving, right? And that is because of important constitutional principles, right? So we have a case right now pending in district court in Washington, D.C., on behalf of a couple, lesbian couple in Fort Worth, who actually stepped up to be foster parents for children in a different government-funded system. So they were trying to be foster parents for a refugee child, and were turned away from Catholic Charities in Fort Worth because they didn't, quote, mirror the Holy Family. Right? So interestingly enough, the agency was actually soliciting the couple, unbeknownst to them, I think in part because of their names. They didn't realize they were a same-sex couple. And Fatma Maroof, one of our clients, is actually an immigration law professor at Texas A&M and had been working with them. So they were soliciting her to be a foster parent. And then she said, my wife, and they suddenly said, oh, you're not suitable now because you don't quote mirror the Holy Family. So we're suing the Department of Health and Human Services, the federal agency, that puts out the federal funds for these contracts, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is the entity that gets the funds and then doles them out to local chapters like Fort Worth Catholic Charities. So, I mean, our claims are a violation of the Establishment Clause, equal protection, and due process. So, an example of the agency substituting their own religious beliefs about who is suitable to be parents, and obviously rejecting the dignity of a couple's marriage.
But these constitutional arguments, Currey, and I guess this is where I'm going in trying to understand how these state laws either will survive or not survive constitutional challenge in the future. And you give us a great example to try and illustrate this issue. The Constitution doesn't include the language sexual orientation. It doesn't include LGBTQ. It doesn't talk about same-sex marriage. So this is where it seems the tension is in how courts are going to interpret what does equal protection mean. We know that discrimination on the basis of race and gender are fully protected in terms of those classes of American citizens, but there still is a big question mark as a matter of constitutional interpretation. I'm not saying there should be, but I think we're seeing this as it's playing out in the court, that there is this question mark. So how do you see that playing out, and where do laws like the Oklahoma law, or like the example you're giving us that's being litigated right now in DC, how do those issues play out as a constitutional matter, do you think?
Well, and I think, obviously, while the Obergefell case is not, exactly about this particular situation, I mean, I think it does provide a pretty clear roadmap, especially regarding like dignity of these, relationships, and, specifically got at parenting, right?
You're referring to the Supreme Court case that recognized a right under the Constitution to same-sex marriages, and
yes,
a right not to be discriminated against if you're a same-sex couple in terms of marriage.
Right, in terms of marriage, but a big piece of that opinion was talking about parenting, and the right for same-sex couples to parent, and we saw really important amicus briefs from folks like the American Sociological Association, basically saying, all the information and data we have is that same-sex couples are just as good a parents as different sex couples, and like there's no there in terms of any kind of justification for saying that same-sex couples can't be good parents, right? And
there's a religious objection, right? I mean, that's where this is all coming from. I mean, there's not a social science objection. There's a religious-based objection.
Right, but that's fine if that's your belief as part of your church or your personal faith, but it's different if you are using government funds.
Well, see, that seems like the key right there.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, these are federal dollars. These aren't private citizens, exercising their beliefs or practicing their faith in a church, mosque, or synagogue. I mean, these are organizations that are getting federal dollars and are using those federal dollars to discriminate.
Right, and therein lies the issues with the constitutionality of these and problems, and I think also, this notion that from some of the agencies that we're sort of entitled to be able to do this, when actually you're stepping up to apply for a contract. You don't have a right as a child placing agency to a government contract.
Right.
You're stepping up to apply, and within that comes the recognition that you're serving everyone and need to do so equally, And again, going back to sort of federal law and the professional standards, I mean, doing so consistent with what organizations that talk about the welfare of children, have to say, which I think is another piece of sort of, this analysis, which is, in some aspects of sort of balancing people's important right to religious freedom and government's impact on that right, there's sort of a balancing test involved. And in these particular situations with these child welfare religious refusal laws, there is no balancing test involved. Like in Texas's law, for example, the best interest of the children is mentioned in the preamble, which doesn't have the effect of law. So it's basically providers' religious right trumps, no pun intended, and and there you go.
Right. So, we've talked about Oklahoma that just passed this law, and some other states that have had laws like these religious refusal / anti-LGBTQ laws on the books. And you've told us about the case that Lambda Legal is involved with, involving Catholic Charities in Texas. Are these other state laws now actively being challenged in the court? And if not, is that something you expect to see in the coming months?
Yes, there is one challenge that is in the court that is about one of these laws specifically, and that's a case filed by the ACLU in Michigan, Dumont v. Lyon, that is specifically about Michigan's version of one of these license to discriminate laws in the child welfare context. So it'll be interesting to see how that proceeds. So I think between our Maroof case and the ACLU's case in Michigan, I mean we will soon have some rulings from the court that are related to this question about being able to use religion to discriminate in the context of providing government services to children.
Now, we've talked a little bit about what's happening in the courts in this regard, and these are, after all, measures that are being passed at the state level in the state legislatures. There are groups, one in particular that I've read about, the Alliance Defending Freedom, very patriotic sounding name, but an organization that is pushing these measures at in varying state legislatures, and that's been identified as supporting and lobbying for these kinds of laws. As an advocate as well as a lawyer, is there a counter strategy in state legislatures going on right now to educate, to inform, to indeed lobby against these types of measures that you see?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and I think more fundamentally, there has been and continues to be a really strong and important movement to have child welfare systems, as I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, really be affirming for all children and all families in the system, and that's significant for a number of reasons. And one is, the studies and data that we have show that about 20% of kids in foster care identify as LGBT. Right? And we also know that historically, either sort of enshrined in law or policy, or just because of general stigma and prejudice, LGBT people have not been welcome in a lot of systems as resources as foster and adoptive parents. So many states have moved towards having sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes, either in agency policy or in places in state law or regulation, right? And what we've seen there is that, providers have training on how to serve LGBT youth and families. They're able to actually embrace and license and serve appropriately both families of origin that are LGBT who can be placements for relative kids that are in foster care, and also foster and adoptive parents. So that work is going on and
Mm-hmm.
continues to go on. We're involved with that. A lot of other national and local LGBT rights organizations and affirming providers are doing that. So that's the most important thing. I mean, these attempts to carve out some license to discriminate are really just a small piece of what's going on, a really harmful one.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not where things are headed.
Mm-hmm.
Where things are headed is actually, having systems that are affirming and supportive. So, these providers that are trying to push these laws are a small, but unfortunately a very vocal minority, which actually has outsized political power in
Mm-hmm.
some places. And, Kansas and Oklahoma are good examples. I mean,
Right.
the people who are legislators who control things, and unfortunately it appears the governors, appear to completely support this notion
Right.
that the government can pay providers. And you know, uh, some of the proponents also push this, oh, well, folks can just be served somewhere else, so what's the big deal? But it is a big deal in that, these are anti-LGBT measures that are harmful to children because
Yeah.
they are a government-endorsed message that LGBT people aren't good parents.
Right.
And, I've worked directly with young people who are in care, LGBT young people who are in care, who, have said to me, I actually want to be a foster parent because I needed a safe and affirming home and I didn't have one, and I want to provide that for kids. But now, like, these laws basically say that I'm not a good parent.
Yeah.
And, that really is not only a disincentive, but is harmful to me. So, we talk often about the harm to children of these laws by reducing the amount of placements, but which is important, but it's
Mm-hmm.
way more than that, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about dignity. Justice Kennedy talked about dignity in the same-sex marriage opinion, and
Yes.
yeah, to be identified as someone who is identified because of sexual orientation, is identified as someone who really is a second-class citizen in these ways.
Yes.
Yeah, you have to imagine that causes a tremendous harm, and it's a tremendous harm, I think, to our country. I mean, this is not what we should be standing for either.
Right.
So it's
And then,
reassuring.
I'll also add in our Maroof case, so Catholic Charities Fort Worth actually, they also told our clients that our client Fatma said, well, what about the LGBT kids that you're serving in your program? And they said, we don't have any LGBT kids that we're serving. So it's this, ridiculous notion that these providers who are providing homes, and serving kids who are in care actually don't have LGBT youth in their care, and that they can simultaneously say or pretend to say we can adequately care for the youth in our care, and at the same time say that LGBT people aren't good parents. So, for example, of a lesbian couple who are foster parents in Kansas who have a gay young man who ended up in their care because he was kicked out by his adoptive parents after he came out because of their religion. They refused to continue to care for him, and he ended up back in the foster care system. So, having a system where we're sort of having providers that are explicitly about recruiting people who don't think LGBT people are equal really has a lot of harm for kids who, are working through their identity and now are going to be in environments where they have clearly gotten the message that it's not safe to come out. And if they in fact do, they could be kicked out and not have a home anymore. And that is just profoundly disturbing.
Well, it is an election year too, 2018, and we often focus on, when we talk about midterm elections for Congress, but state legislators are also elected. And so voters in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, Michigan, this is something that you should be paying attention to. And Currey, thank you so much for coming on our program and educating me and educating our listeners about this really important issue. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add too. I
Yeah.
think that back to your original point of sort of why aren't we hearing more about this? And I think a piece of it is child welfare systems are confidential. Thankfully, most people don't have to have interactions with child welfare systems themselves, unless they're stepping up to help in some way. And so I think we've seen in many ways how what's happening in these systems goes under the radar because of the factors I mentioned. And I think, that contributes to the lack of awareness and understanding of what happens in these. But I think we need people to focus on these for what they are, that they're anti-LGBTQ measures, just as others are, and more significantly, they harm kids in foster care in the process.
Absolutely. Currey, thanks again. I appreciate your time and thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great.